One was a kitchen, the other was probably a storage room, a very nice ginning circle. We actually had a very creative art to really understand this as an island plantation, looking at the ways in which both the planter himself and his family interacted with other planter families, and also the ways in which the slaves themselves were interacting with slaves on other plantations. And there's certainly a good sense of how San Salvador then interacts with the outside world. Looking at the archaeology, it really started to give us some sort of clues to some other sort of questions around comparative architecture. One of the really interesting things that we started to try to look at was the ways in which manor houses differed on different plantations. The manor house is the building that was most personal probably to the planter. It was the place where he and his family were going to spend most of the time. It's where he was going to make his greatest mark. And one of the things that struck us on San Salvador generally was that these plantation manor houses were not all exactly the same. They have some common Bahamian elements, but they are different in really important ways. On the top right is Sandy Point Plantation, or Watling's Castle. It's sort of, in many ways, what people might think of as a typical Bahamian plantation. It's built up with a large basement area. It's built in cut stone. The primary living space is probably on that raised first floor with verandas, some kind of attic space. A very sort of typical plantation house. On the left, however, is the remains of Holly Hill Plantation. It was a very different kind of plantation structure. It was 2 stories. It was a full 2 stories. You entered it on the ground floor, which would have been living space because there was a porch space out front. There was not a door directly into the second floor. A very different kind of design for a house, but one that, since it was relatively close to the ocean, may not have needed to try to be so high to catch those breezes. Then we have the manor house at Prospect Hill, which is not in very good repair, and it's sort of hard to see. This is actually the veranda out in front. It was actually constructed at ground level. It's only 1 story high. This is one side of it. And it turns out he lived in the mainland U.S. as a loyalist. If he did, it would only have been when he was very young. And so he probably has little or no experience as in the mainland, sort of like trying to figure out, okay, we really know who this person is. Can't we say something about why his plantation is so different? Well, we know that Charles Farquharson is Scottish. He was born, as I remember, in the 1770s. Probably never lived. Has a really unusual floor plan. That's where we started to get really interested in Charles Farquharson. I've used this before. That's sort of my standard. You know, he certainly did not look like that, but it's a wonderful little, like, there he is. So I certainly hope he didn't look like that. Okay, so one of the things I started to look at was understanding the nature of this house. I wondered, what do Scottish farmhouses look like in the late 18th century? And one of the things is they look different than English farmhouses in this period. But on the left is a very typical Scottish farmhouse from the late 18th century. They're low 1-story buildings, usually built of various kinds of stone, building techniques. There are about 4 different ways that they build, one of which would replicate to what's here in the Bahamas. But that's the way they are, these low 1-story on-the-ground buildings, which is the way the manor house at Prospect Hill looks. It would have been a really hot building. I would never build a building like this far inland on San Salvador, because all the breeze is going right over your roof. The floor plan also is not a British colonial design, or at least certainly not a late 18th century British colonial design. It's a design that really had been pretty well abandoned in the mainland United States by about 1700, and it's called the Cross Passage Plan. This is not exactly the way Farquharson's was, but it's characterized by open space that runs through the building that allowed servants, in this case slaves and others, to be able to actually pass through the house without entering it. The kitchen would be placed on one side, or in this particular case, probably a main house as the kitchen, main room, since the kitchen was separate. And on the other side, you have more private space that was used by the family. This is completely different floor plan than what you would find at most other Bahamian plantations. And I'm really struck by the fact that it really, though, is a very common floor plan in late 18th century Scotland. So what are some other things? One of the other things that are really interesting is the design element of what we believe was the first kitchen built at Farquarson. There were probably 2 kitchens built at the plantation, and this seems to be the older one. On the top right is the kitchen at Sandy Point. This is sort of that very typical large kitchen that would be designed for cooking large amounts of food that the slaves would have worked on. You can find these kitchens with these massive fireplaces all throughout the southeastern United States as well. Well, in Scotland in the 18th century, as there was a real move to try to create sort of a sense of being a middling sort person, I don't want to say middle class, but more prosperous farmers. People, Scotland's going through a lot of changes in the 18th century. These large fireplaces were not only considered old-fashioned there, they were viewed as a sign of poverty. And one of the things you did in the 18th century is you either built a new house or you bricked in your fireplace and made it smaller, because the large fireplace suggested huge communal United States as a planter. So his background is different. So what's really interesting is if it sort of gives us a sense of to what degree does the mindset of the planter really help to structure the way these plantations were like. So, and perhaps they really result in material culture differences. So the way buildings are, and perhaps the way these plantations developed were different because these planters were different.
Can we just tell, that's not.
This is not Charles Farquharson. This is the Farquharson family plaid. We have no picture of Charles Farquharson. So I've actually used this before. So it's his tartan. Yes. So I always just love this. When I have to come up with something that's
important source. And as much as possible, there are some really strong efforts that were also made to use this journal to tell us about what life was like on plantations outside of the New Providence and the more historically richly documented area of Nassau. But as with any single historical source that is in itself sort of particularistic, it's the day-to-day happenings on the life of a plantation, the ability to extrapolate is always sort of a guessing game. It gets on that little tenuous ground for historians. So we wanted to sort of come back and do some archaeology at Prospect Hill because it offers some possibilities of expanding the usefulness and
really going into the fireplace. And the interesting thing is that the first fireplace at Prospect Hill was very much like that. This is a smaller contained fireplace that was put in the kitchen in Prospect Hill. We're starting to begin to do some very preliminary artifact comparisons between different plantations. And there's a real challenge at Prospect Hill and a very unexpected challenge. Polly Hill, where we did our first 3 seasons, was an incredibly artifact-rich site. We have thousands of artifacts in our 3 seasons working there. It reflects its long occupation of probably more than 100 years. Kermount, we were not at all surprised when we went to Kermount, and we had very few artifacts. We knew that the plantation had been largely abandoned as a living space by the 1830s. We didn't expect to find a lot of things. But what's surprising is that Prospect Hill, we also have relatively few artifacts, even though we know the plantation was occupied by Charles Farquharson's son, James Farquharson, into the 1860s. Why are there so few artifacts? And that's one of the questions we're trying to investigate in the next year or so. And we have a suspicion that it was perhaps because of ongoing activities around this plantation all the way into the 20th century. And particularly, probably some of those U.S. military men were going and visiting, picking up stuff and taking it back. And the reason we know that is a couple years ago, Kathy Gerace got a box of ceramics from a former U.S. military guy who had been going to Sandy Point Plantation all during the time he was there, picking stuff up. And it was like about half the size of a Xerox box. So one of the things we're beginning to realize is that even after occupation, after they're no longer occupied, these plantations had a dynamic history in the 20th century, which may not be so good for the architecture or for the archaeological record. So what are our plans for 2010? We're going to focus our excavations on the slave quarter at Prospect Hill. Certainly when Kathy Gerace worked at Prospect Hill, she found fewer artifacts in the main yard and more artifacts in the slave